Experiences like pleasure and pain actually have no real existence at all. They are neither experienced by the body, which is dead matter and has no awareness of its own, nor are they experienced by the soul, which is untouched by material fluctuations like happiness and distress. These so-called experiences, which are products of the mind alone, are simply avidya, or ignorance. Welcome back to Diary of Devotion's weekly study on Bhagavad Gita. Let's jump right into chapter 2. Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. When we left off, Krishna just finished explaining the eternality of the soul to Arjuna. That was text 12 of chapter 2. Now he's going to take it even further. He's going to demonstrate what that soul does in its eternal state as it moves through the material creation. Okay, text 13, Krishna says, as the embodied soul continually passes in this body, from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. A sober person is not bewildered by such a change. And so Krishna is anticipating the natural question that arises from the notion that the soul is eternal. Namely, if the body is temporary, but the soul is eternal, what happens to the soul after the death of the body? And so Krishna introduces here the idea of reincarnation, relating it to the easily understandable phenomenon of aging. When we occupy the bodies of young children, complete with a sense of I, a sense that we are individual, and that as individuals we possess a perspective as a subject, when our bodies become middle-aged, they change dramatically and bear little resemblance to the bodies that we had as children. But still, that sense of I remains. That sense that I'm a subject of my own experience is unchanged. This experience of being the subject of my own life, my own experience of the world, continues, Krishna says, into old age and even after death. And so think about it. Our psychological experience in old age may be radically different from our experience in youth. And yet still, that experience of I-ness, that experience that I am, remains. Similarly, after death, when we assume another body, our psychological experience may be very different from the one that we're experiencing right now. And yet the selfhood, that sense of self, still remains throughout. That core sense of self is called the Atma. Atma is often translated as soul, and we can think of it in that way. But the fundamental thing that we need to understand about this idea of Atma is that it's the core self, that core sense of subjective experience, that conscious awareness that understands that I am. That is the ultimate self. That is the Atma. Okay, Krishna continues in text 14. He says, O son of Kunti, meaning Arjuna, the non-permanent appearance of happiness and distress and their disappearance in due course are like the appearance and disappearance of winter and summer seasons. They arise from sense perception, O Scion of Bharat, and one must learn to tolerate them without being disturbed. So despite the fact that Krishna has demonstrated that there's a fundamental difference between the Atma or soul and the material body or dead matter, the Atma, the self, is still perceiving the information that's coming through these bodily senses. So they're not completely separated in this sense. They're interconnected. And so what's to be done? Here, Krishna recommends tolerance of sense perceptions and the happiness and distress that naturally go along with them. And so the fact is that one who's identified with the material body is continually going to be searching outward for sense objects in order to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. But Krishna says that this coming and going of happiness and distress, it's fundamental to perceiving with the senses to begin with. You can't get away from that roller coaster, that up and down, if you're going to be searching for happiness through the senses. Not only that, but this happiness and distress, it comes naturally of its own accord, just like the winter and summer seasons. You don't have to reach out and try to be happy. Eventually, because of the state of mind that you happen to be in a particular circumstance, you'll become happy on your own accord. And similarly, because of the same circumstances, you'll become unhappy. And so just as there's no use for trying to prevent the onset of winter and preserve summer, there's no use in trying to preserve happiness and prevent sadness. So this tolerance isn't just recommended for its own sake, however. The Vaishnava saint Ramanuja explains that once karma ceases to be produced by false identification with my body and my mind, that suffering and happiness, that too will cease. This cessation occurs because, although the senses are still active and engaged with their objects, the wise individual no longer thinks himself to be this body, and thus the recipient of the pleasure and pain caused by it. Once this state of consciousness is achieved, as Krishna is going to explain in the following verse, then one becomes eligible for liberation. Liberation from what? From happiness and distress, from the constant ups and downs of material experience. Text 15, Krishna says, "O best among men," meaning Arjuna, "the person who is not disturbed by happiness and distress and is steady in both is certainly eligible for liberation." So that state of being that accompanies steadiness in all circumstance is high indeed. We shouldn't think ourselves inadequate if we don't immediately attain this state. Nor is it recommended to prematurely think that we've attained this high status before it's actually been achieved. However, as Krishna will explain later, this state is the inevitable condition that we'll find ourselves in when we practice bhakti yoga with vigor and determination. Challenges will arise, setbacks will be encountered. Of this, there is no doubt. But just as strength is the inevitable result of doing exercises, so too is steadiness the inevitable result of bhakti yoga. Okay, Krishna continues. Text 16. "Those who are seers of the truth have concluded that of the non-existent, in other words, the material body, there is no endurance, and of the eternal, meaning the soul, there is no change. This they have concluded by studying the nature of both." Commenting on this verse, the Vaishnavacharya Vishwanath Chakravarti says that experiences like pleasure and pain actually have no real existence at all. They are neither experienced by the body, which is dead matter and has no awareness of its own, nor are they experienced by the soul, which is untouched by material fluctuations like happiness and distress. These so-called experiences, which are products of the mind alone, are simply avidya, or ignorance. Krishna continues, "That which pervades the entire body you should know to be indestructible. No one is able to destroy that imperishable soul." Okay, so an objection might be raised here. If the soul pervades the body and is therefore limited to that specific shape, place, and time, it must be bounded by some contingent material factors and is therefore perishable. I mean, think about it. If the only things that are limited, that are finite, are material things, that are created within this material platform, everything within the material platform is finite. It's subject to destruction. And so the soul seems to be bounded by the body that it's within. So doesn't that mean that the soul is something material and therefore temporary? In response to this question, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur comments that according to the Vedic scriptures like the Upanishads and Srimad Bhagavatam, the soul is extremely minute and also very subtle. In some scriptures, the soul is described as being 1/10,000th the width of the tip of a hair. I don't think we should take this as a scientific calculation as to the actual size of the soul, but simply an illustration of how minute it actually is. And just as air may pervade a pot with a lid, once that lid is lifted, the air is no longer bound by that form and it can abide in its pervasive nature. Nothing about the nature of the air has changed once the lid on the pot has been removed. It's simply free to abide in its unlimitedness at that point. And so similarly, just as no weapon can cut, burn, or destroy the air, the soul, which is far subtler than air, can never be harmed, even though the gross material body may be. Furthermore, the soul can't even be comprehended, since the soul is the subject of knowledge rather than the object of knowledge. Just as fire may burn an object, there's nothing that can burn fire. Therefore, that which knows may know many things, but there's no way for the knower to know itself. Okay, Krishna continues. Text 18, he says, "The material body of the indestructible, immeasurable, and eternal living entity is sure to come to an end. Therefore, fight, O descendant of Bharat." Krishna concludes here that because Arjuna's object of love is in fact the souls of his relatives rather than their bodies, and the souls can never be harmed, he ought not to shirk his duty out of fear of harming his relatives' bodies, which are in any case finite. If this still seems problematic to us, we would be wise to remember that Arjuna is not simply facing a benign gathering of family members here. He's facing family members that have repeatedly assaulted him and his family members and have aggrieved the populace in general. If the son of the President of the United States was prone to robbery or murder, we would expect the president to agree to his just punishment and refrain from putting any obstacles that might inhibit this. Similarly, these Kauravas that Arjuna is now facing have committed crimes beyond the tolerance of anyone with good sense. Krishna continues, "Neither he who thinks the living entity the slayer, nor he who thinks it slain is in knowledge, for the self slays not, nor is slain." So Krishna is now expanding his description of the attributes of the soul. To say that the soul is immortal, unfazed by material conditions, and eternally blissful is one thing. But now Krishna reveals that the soul actually commits no actions at all. As Narayan Maharaj explains, it's only those who identify with the body and who are ignorant of who they really are, who think that in battle it is they who kill or who risk being killed. In fact, if we accept that the material body is made of dead matter and is animated by the presence of the soul, which remains unchanged and untouched by the material nature, then the body itself must be acting in accordance with the laws of nature. Therefore, it is nature that compels the body to act on another material object or body. Text 20. "For the soul there is neither birth nor death at any time. He has not come into being, does not come into being, and will not come into being. He is unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval. He is not slain when the body is slain." So here Krishna is clarifying why the soul is not actually the agent of action. As Tripurari Maharaj comments, committing an action requires change. Even the simple act of sitting still requires the muscles to hold up the body and make fine adjustments to keep us upright. Calories are burned by the simple process of life itself, and in any case, the body can never stop aging, even when doing nothing at all. For the soul, however, no change is ever observed. Therefore, because any kind of action requires change, the soul is never the doer of any action. Indeed, the soul has never even come into being, which means that it's never even transformed from a state of non-existence to a state of existence. It's that firmly situated. Okay, text 21. "O Partha," that means Arjuna, "how can a person who knows that the soul is indestructible, eternal, unborn, and immutable kill anyone or cause anyone to kill?" At this point, someone might argue that, okay, even though the soul is eternal and actually unharmed by the death of the body, it's still immoral for the soul to give up association with the present body it inhabits. Krishna answers this objection in the next verse. He says, "As a person puts on new garments, giving up old ones, the soul similarly accepts new material bodies, giving up the old and useless ones." And so Tripurari Maharaj comments that even though some of the warriors who oppose Arjuna certainly identify with their bodies and would be deeply aggrieved at losing them, others, like the saintly Bhishma, will rejoice at the prospect. The refutation of this argument lies in the observation of which army Lord Krishna finds himself in. The Almighty Lord placed himself at the heart of the army which fights for justice, because he himself is justice personified. He rejects the notion that any killing at all is to be permitted, and rather instructs that killing should be undertaken as a last result, and only for the ultimate good of the world. Those familiar with the Mahabharata, which is the larger story that surrounds the Bhagavad Gita, they'll understand that Krishna repeatedly attempted to mediate peace between the two warring parties. This ultimately failed, and it was only after that that we found ourselves facing this battle. Okay, Krishna's going on. He says, "The soul can never be cut to pieces by any weapon, nor burned by fire, nor moistened by water, nor withered by the wind. This individual soul is unbreakable and insoluble, and can neither be burned nor dried. He is everlasting, present everywhere, unchangeable, immovable, and eternally the same." Vishwanath Chakravarti comments that the soul is present everywhere, as it states in this verse, in the sense that it takes all kinds of bodies in species of every kind. Jiva Goswami indicates that the present everywhere claim means that when the soul takes exclusive shelter of the Lord, he experiences all-pervasiveness since he's under the shelter of the one who's all-pervasive. When we take shelter of the Lord and we start to identify with him more than our contingent bodies, we naturally take on his qualities, like all-pervasiveness, blissfulness, knowledge, beauty, and so on. Okay, text 25. It is said that the soul is invisible, inconceivable, and immutable. Knowing this, you should not grieve for the body. If, however, you think that the soul, or the symptoms of life, will always be born and die forever, you still have no reason to lament, O mighty armed. One who has taken his birth is sure to die, and after death, one is sure to take birth again. Therefore, in the unavoidable discharge of your duty, you should not lament. We know that all that lives must eventually die. To not kill an aggressor who threatens the lives of many people when there's no other option except to be killed oneself, that aggressor is not ultimately spared death, for all will die eventually. It's much better to do the just and dharmic thing rather than to simply stand by and watch irreligion and adharma predominate. Krishna continues, all created beings are unmanifest in their beginning, manifest in their interim state, and unmanifest again when annihilated. So what need is there for lamentation? All things that come into existence must have been unmanifest before that. All beings that come into existence must also eventually go out of existence and become unmanifest once again. What then is lost by manifest beings returning to its unmanifest state? Text 29, Krishna continues, some look on the soul as amazing. Some describe him as amazing, and some hear of him as amazing, while others, even after hearing about him, cannot understand him at all. Okay, text 30. O descendant of Bharat, he who dwells in the body can never be slain. Therefore, you need not grieve for any living being. Considering your specific duty as a kshatriya, meaning a warrior, you should know that there is no better engagement for you than fighting on religious principles. And so there is no need for hesitation. Tripurari Maharaj comments here that because the realization of the philosophical truths that is being explained by Krishna here tends to make one detached from worldly affairs, Krishna re-emphasizes Arjuna's duty to fight for justice. And so it's interesting because when we start to have realizations of what Krishna is talking about here, about our fundamental difference from the material reality, we may want to give up the material reality altogether. Nonetheless, if we have a family, if we're responsible for someone else's welfare, if we're responsible for defending the populace, we still have to perform those duties. Because Krishna is fundamentally situated on the side of righteousness and dharma, and those actions further the welfare of all beings connected to them. Okay, text 32. O Partha, happy are the kshatriyas to whom such fighting opportunities come unsought, opening for them the doors of the heavenly planets. Ramanuja comments here that it is only the fortunate warriors, in other words, the meritorious ones, who attain opportunities to fight in just wars. Whether they experience victory or defeat, their fame is assured. Even in our own time, we understand that the warriors who fought against great tyrants like Adolf Hitler are deserving of fame, for such was a just war. Krishna here claims that falling in such just wars even opens the gates of the heavenly planets. Krishna continues, if, however, you do not perform your religious duty of fighting, then you will certainly incur sins for neglecting your duties and thus lose your reputation as a fighter. And so, just as when we look on warriors who fight in just wars as being righteous, whether they win or lose, similarly, if one shirks one's duty to fight in such a war, onlookers to that act will think that that person is a coward regardless of the motives they have for not fighting. Krishna continues, he says, people will always speak of your infamy, and for a respectable person, dishonor is worse than death. So it's important at this juncture to remember that Arjuna is part of the warrior class. He's a kshatriya. And while some of us may think little of losing our honor, for others, like Arjuna, honor is dearer than their very life. Warriors, generally speaking, are of the latter type. By warrior, I don't mean anyone who's compelled to fight by the force of government. Rather, I mean those in whom something intrinsic is roused when a battle nears that compels them to run toward combat rather than away from it. That's the warrior that we're talking about here. Okay, text 35. The great generals who have highly esteemed your name and fame will think that you have left the battlefield out of fear only, and thus they will consider you insignificant. Your enemies will describe you in many unkind words and scorn your ability. What could be more painful for you? O son of Kunti, either you will be killed on the battlefield and attain the heavenly planets, or you will conquer and enjoy the earthly kingdom. Therefore, get up with determination and fight. And so Ramanuja interestingly comments here that Arjuna is guaranteed to attain happiness no matter what the outcome of the actual war. And so Krishna is insinuating here that the righteousness of doing a dharmic action is not contingent on the success or failure of that action. It's the intention that's the important thing. Krishna continues, do thou fight for the sake of fighting, without considering happiness or distress, loss or gain, victory or defeat. And by so doing, you shall never incur sin. Okay, so what then is a sin? Since Krishna doesn't attach sin to the act of killing in a general sense, but rather to the act of unjust or adharmic killing, sin must be judged in context. In the 5th canto, 26th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, which is a canonical text for Vaishnava Hindus, various sins and their subsequent punishments are described. In most cases, the sin is explicitly judged to be a punishable offense only when mitigating circumstances are absent. For instance, one is subject to punishment in hell if he hunts unnecessarily simply for the pleasure of killing animals. No punishment is mentioned, however, for those who hunt out of necessity when no other means of sustenance is available. Practically speaking, vegetarian is available to almost all of us, with the only barriers being cultural, psychological, or habitual. Still, in rare circumstances when a person's health depends on the consumption of some product obtained from the suffering of an animal, this circumstance mitigates any hellish punishment. Ramanuja reminds us here that, in an ultimate sense, sin is that which keeps us within the cycle of birth and death. That's often called samsara, because sins incur just reactions and don't lead to the path where we transcend this material existence. It keeps us in the transmigratory cycle of reincarnation. Okay, we're going to leave it here for this week. Next week, we're going to pick it up where we hear a detailed explanation of karma yoga. Join us again. Jai Shri Radhe.